Hi all. So today we are moving into the 18th century to map some of the changes that we see emerge in this period. Some of our material is especially difficult to read. Jefferson's text in particular uses derogatory language in his discussion of slavery. This material, however, does help us contextualize the key tensions facing the development of the nation. And I also think that it sheds a unique light on our so-called language of liberty and freedom. It will also be useful in helping us understand the abolitionist responses that will come next week. And so in that way, I am using Jefferson's text in particular as a way of thinking through these issues a little bit more thoroughly. It's a counterpoint of sorts. This is the century or the age of the Enlightenment, and Kant defines the Enlightenment as an emergence from immaturity. We see here in the definition of the Enlightenment, it's described as an intellectual and scientific movement in the 18th century that did encourage people to learn firsthand how the world functions. Unlike the 17th century, in the 18th century, God worked in reasonable and comprehensible ways. It's an orderly system that we can interpret using scientific processes and observations. We also see a new emphasis on social rather than spiritual issues, and this is often accompanied by a rejection of Calvinist doctrine. So Calvinism still holds sway into the 19th century, but certainly not with the same weight that it did in the prior century. Our founding fathers would eventually use this discourse of enlightenment to explain the political aims of independence. Specifically, we see an emphasis on England as kind of the mother or parent figure, whereas the American colonies is described somewhat like a child, whereas then the United States is our coming into our maturity, becoming an adult of sorts. We see this language in particular in Paine, Paine's text Common Sense, on pages 684 and 685, if you take a quick look at that. But it is important to keep in mind that by 1775, American colonists were actively seeking out this new identity, one that got told and debated through print. And there is a series of events that gets us to this point in time. Those are outlined on your slide in case you need a refresher from your history classes. But as I mentioned, this kind of seeking out a new identity, this maturity of sorts, gets told through print. Print has a very important part in the construction of this new American identity. In fact, some scholars argue that the American Revolution was a propaganda war, and the control over how the conflict was represented was key to winning that debate. And a kind of a example of that would be Paul Revere's engraving of the Bloody Massacre, which is on your slide. It's obviously for independence for the United States as this new nation, because it's describing or visualizing the colonists at a disadvantage in comparison to the British troops that are nicely well organized and seemingly firing on a group of innocent, non-weapon wielding individuals, right? So it's a kind of a one-sided representation of the Boston Massacre. So our texts for today do illustrate the importance of print to the creation of the United States and the definition of who could claim the title of American citizen. In a scholarly work called Imagined Communities, the scholar Benedict Anderson outlines this relationship in his print culture thesis. And these are assertions that many scholars use in their approach to their study of the early republic. It basically offers an academic explanation of the link between nation and print, describing the rise of national print infrastructures as functioning in tandem with the rise of democratic polities, and posits that print culture is directly related to the rise of nationalism. So we tend to emphasize four key aspects. The first is that nations are invented, so we create a nation. That in order to create a nation, you have to imagine connections between people who will never meet one another face to face. So I'm an American just like somebody living in, I don't know, California or Maine are Americans, even though we don't share anything else beyond that connection. Right? It also assumes that the printed texts are central to producing this sense of connection between fellow nationals, and finally, as a result, citizens are readers and readers are citizens, right? So in order to kind of participate in this construction of the nation, you have to participate in the consumption of print. Now, Thomas Paine's Common Sense and Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence both were very central in kind of constructing an early version of the American identity. Common Sense was published in January of 1776, and it called for the need to resist the British, to come together as one people. And Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, which literally created us as a nation, it declared us a nation, that was dated a few months later. So it was a response to Thomas Paine's call. While I am planning to save the conversation about Jefferson and Crevecoeur for the discussion video, I do want to say a few words before we get to Jefferson on Thomas Paine's Common Sense. And I would note that his approach is an emphasis on the colonists as a kind of a new kind of people. And he begins on 683. If you want to quickly turn to his text, I won't spend too much time here. So this is a slight digression. But on 683, he does describe the cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind. And that sounds a lot like the city upon the hill language that we saw with Winthrop in the earlier time period. So we can kind of see how that New England fallacy and that link of American exceptionalism is created. He emphasizes throughout as well that the colonists aren't just English, but claim a more universal brotherhood. He says we carry our friendship on a larger scale. We claim brotherhood with every European Christian, and that's on 685, so the following page. We flip the page. But toward the end of the third chapter, Paine also encourages his readers to transport us for a few moments to Boston. And on 687, that's where you see that language. And he notes that it's our feelings and affections on the next page for those suffering in Boston that should become more important than any false affection we might feel for England. And this helps to justify in Paine's argument the creating a government of our own, as he states. It is our natural right. And any connection with Britain in the face of these atrocities, by comparison, are forced and unnatural. So, with texts like Paine, we do see a pre-revolutionary discourse that tended to emphasize the need to revolt. It is important to also keep in mind that post-revolutionary texts, or texts produced in what we call the early republic, tended to focus on the development of a robust nation and a new concern over the citizenry. So how the citizenry was going to function within this new nation. And with the fading away of Puritan ideology came the belief that an individual's environment had a significant impact on social development. And John Locke's tabula rasa would famously refer to this concept as the idea that the mind was like a blank slate upon which experiences were inscribed. So while Paine's text was very much interested in kind of bringing together all of the colonists into a new national identity, rejecting English identity and the English heritage for something different, something new, Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia is thinking more carefully about what creates a good citizen. And his query on manufacturing suggests that a particular kind of American, specifically the farmer, was what kind of exemplified that good citizenry or that good citizenship. He was a strong proponent for what was called the Yeoman Republic, or an argument that imagines the United States as a farmer nation while England continues to manufacture goods out of American raw material, as your slide states. He was dismissive of industrialization for its encouragement of so-called vice. And his text then, like Crevecoeur's Letters from the American Farmer, which was fictional, whereas Jefferson's query was not, both kind of emphasize not only the importance of kind of developing this farmer nation, but also the role of environment or the geographic locale on the soon-to-be American citizenry. And for Crevecoeur specifically, he makes an argument that there's three different types of Americans: those that live near the sea, those that live in the middle settlements or farmers, and those that live on the frontier, what he calls the backwoodsmen. And he gives decided preference to the farmers themselves. Of course, it's written in the voice of Farmer James. So I'll discuss the writings more in the discussion video, but would like to take a moment to set up the context for their perceptions. And to do so, give a little background on the notes of the state of Virginia. So it was initially an answer to 22 questions drawn up by a Frenchman in the United States about the United States. And these questions eventually made their way to Jefferson, who opted to respond in a very weirdly extensive way in what became Notes, which is extremely a longish text. You guys are only reading a small excerpt of it. Jefferson was influenced by the emerging scientific discourses of the Age of Enlightenment, and specifically he was pissed off by the representations of the New World posed by a scientist named Buffon. Now, Buffon believed in climatology, which is basically the idea that climate or environment was the principal causes of the varieties of mankind. He claimed, as Timothy Sweet points out in the quote at the top of your slide, that American nature was inferior, specifically that the New World produced fewer kinds of large quadrupeds than did the Old World, and that these were less robust than their Old World analogs, and that Old World animals imported to the New World degenerated. Right, so Old World pigs were bigger and better than the teeny tiny New World piglets, or so the theory would kind of go. Now, Buffon's theory is an example of the developing pseudo-scientific discourses of the period. He wasn't alone in his interest in how human species developed over time, and in fact, racial theories and even the notion of race were being explored extensively in the 18th century. And Linnaeus, who's featured on this slide, is another key figure. He posited 4 basic varieties, as he called it, of the human species who developed superficial differences based on differing climates. Linnaeus believed that these varieties were fixed and eternal, whereas Buffon rejected this fixity but did argue for a similar taxonomy of sorts, and specifically that the European race was the original race and everything else was a degeneration, and this is his language, from the norm, quote-unquote norm. So while for Buffon, he uses this as a critique of North America that makes Jefferson angry, right? Because Europe, in that sense, is better than North America. And Jefferson, to a certain extent, his query is trying to respond to that scientific debate. But more importantly for our purposes is how such views supported a racist ideology. And if you take a look at the slide, you can see how Linnaeus' taxonomy privileges the Caucasian race over others and uses language that would eventually become derogatory racial stereotypes. So the Americanus is specifically referring to Native Americans, all right? So not necessarily Europeans who've come to America. And then, of course, the Africanus, we will see some of that kind of emphasized as well in Jefferson's language in comparison to those who are of European heritage, who have kind of the best, most positive description in Linnaeus' system. Very important, these kinds of racial taxonomies become very important to debates over the Constitution and the founding of the nation. The colonies weren't always a slave society, and when Africans were first introduced, they were deemed indentured servants. So they had kind of a fixed time in which they worked and labored. By 1670, however, things had shifted, and we'll be talking about slavery's evolution next week, but the Finkelman reading gives you a pretty clear outline of these transformations as a preview, which is one reason why I assigned him as a secondary source to read alongside our primary texts. So the development of a racial classification system, including what's now known as the one-drop rule, or the social and legal principle of racial classification that asserted that any person with even one ancestor of African ancestry was considered Black. This impacted constitutional debates. As Finkelman explains, Southern delegates made it clear that some additional representation for slavery was necessary if they were to adopt the new government. Otherwise, they feared that the North, so states and colonies located in the North, would have, which have more population of white males, would have more weight and more sway than those in the South. So in order to pacify both sides, our founding fathers came up with what is known as the Three-Fifths Compromise, and it was enacted by the Constitutional Convention in 1787. It allowed enslaved Blacks to be counted as part of the population in order to determine representation. They, of course, weren't represented, nor did they have a voice or a vote at the time. It was just a question of counting numbers. Okay. So these decisions would, of course, have a lasting impact on the United States. We'll be exploring writings by African Americans in future weeks. But this week, we will be working with writings by white men. Now, men who had the power and the privilege to claim equality for all if they so desired, and they did not do so. Okay. So as you read the text, consider how Paine, Creve Coeur, and Jefferson approached the question of freedom, how they're defining what it means to be American, who they exclude from that definition, or who they maybe would prefer to exclude. You can also think about how their texts are influenced or not by the new racial classifications emerging in the so-called Enlightenment era. Keeping in mind that these authors felt that the pseudoscience was objective and true, but as modern readers, we can obviously see that they are false and racist, right? So we kind of have to balance both that historical context with our more modern sensibilities. So I'll be talking more about Creve Coeur and Jefferson in the discussion video, so tune in there for more. As always, send me a question if you have any via email. I look forward to hearing your thoughts if you choose to write on these authors for your discussion postings. All right, talk to you later.